It was raining the evening. A stranger's voice broke the silence of the bookshop, and Henry nearly didn't answer. 3 years alone had taught him to keep to himself, to stay in his corner with his books and his memories. But the voice was warm and unhurried, asking if he could help her reach something on the top shelf, and something made him step around the corner. The woman standing there looked at him like he was exactly the person she'd been hoping to find. And what happened after that was nothing he could have planned. Henry was 57, and most of his life had been lived in the space between quiet and quieter. He'd grown up in a small house on the edge of town, where the evenings were long and the radio played low. He'd learned early that books could fill a room the way people never quite could. He married Margaret when he was 30, and she was the kind of woman who made the silence feel like something chosen instead of something that just happened. They spent 22 years together, and most of those years were good ones, the kind that don't make for dramatic stories but make for a good life. Margaret passed 3 years ago in the autumn. When the leaves outside their kitchen window turned the color of old copper, the funeral was small, just a handful of neighbors and the minister from the church on Elm Street. Afterward, Henry went home and sat in his chair and waited for something to feel different. It didn't, not that day, and not for a long time after. The house stayed the same. The coffee maker still brewed 2 cups out of habit before he caught himself, and her reading glasses sat on the nightstand for months before he finally put them in a drawer. What saved him, if that's the right word, was the bookshop. Tillman's Books sat on Maple Street, between the hardware store and the flower shop, a narrow building with a green awning and a bell that rang every time the door opened. Harold Tillman ran the place, a man about Henry's age who didn't say much, but always seemed to know what you were looking for before you did. The shelves went from floor to ceiling, packed tight, and the lamplight was always warm and a little dim like the inside of a memory. Henry started going there on Tuesday and Thursday evenings, just after dinner, when the shop was quiet and the other customers had thinned out. He'd browse the poetry shelf first, then work his way through fiction, pulling books down and reading the first few lines to see if they grabbed him. Sometimes he bought something, sometimes he just read, standing in the aisle, with his coat still on, and Harold never minded. They'd share a nod when Henry came in, and another when he left, and that was enough. It was a routine, and routines were the only thing keeping the days from running together. The corner by the poetry shelf was his spot. There was an old leather chair that no one else ever seemed to sit in. Beside it sat a small table, where Harold left a cup of tea on cold nights without being asked. That corner was where Margaret had once found a book of Rilke poems and read one aloud to him, her voice soft and unhurried, and he could still hear it sometimes if he sat there long enough. He didn't go there to remember her exactly. He went there because it was the one place where the silence didn't press against his chest like a weight. 3 years is a long time to sit with your own quiet, and Henry had gotten good at it. He could fill an evening without speaking a word to anyone, and he'd almost convinced himself that was enough. But there were still nights when he'd set his book down and stare at the wall and feel something hollow beneath his ribs, something that books couldn't reach, no matter how good the story was. But he didn't talk about that, and he didn't let himself wish for more, because wishing had a way of making the quiet feel louder instead of softer. What he couldn't have known was that the quiet he'd perfected was about to be broken by something he'd stopped believing in entirely. It was a Thursday in late October, and the rain had started just after 5, a slow, steady fall that turned the streets dark and made the bookshop feel like the only warm place left in the world. Henry had arrived at his usual time, nodded to Harold, and settled into the leather chair with a collection of Wendell Berry poems he'd been working through for the better part of a week. The shop was nearly empty. A woman in a red coat had browsed the cookbooks for a while and left, and after that it was just Henry and the rain and the soft creak of the old building. He'd been reading for about an hour when he heard footsteps on the other side of the poetry shelf, light and unhurried, moving between the aisles the way someone does when they're not looking for anything in particular, but hoping to find it anyway. He didn't look up. Harold sometimes wandered the shop in the evening straightening stacks, and Henry had long since stopped tracking the sounds of someone else in the room. Then came the voice. Soft, a little lower than he expected, carrying the kind of warmth that reached you before the words did. "Excuse me," it said. "Could you help me reach the top shelf?" Henry looked up from the page, closed the Berry collection, and set it on the table. He walked around the end of the shelf and found a woman standing in the next aisle, one hand resting on a rung of the rolling ladder, the other reaching toward a row of books near the ceiling. She was young, maybe late 20s, with dark hair pulled loosely back and eyes that held the kind of quiet attention that made you feel like you'd been noticed in a way that mattered. She smiled, and it wasn't the polite smile of a stranger making a request. It was something easier than that, more personal, as if she'd been waiting for him to come around that corner, and was glad he finally had. "The one with the blue spine," she said, pointing. "I've been trying to get it for 5 minutes, and I refuse to climb this ladder in these boots." Henry reached up without thinking and pulled the book down. He glanced at the cover as he handed it to her, and something in his chest shifted when he saw what it was. Collection of Rilke's letters. "You read Rilke?" he asked, and the question came out before he could stop it, because he wasn't the kind of man who started conversations with strangers, and certainly not with young women in bookshops. "I do," she said, taking the book and holding it against her chest the way you hold something you've been looking for. "My grandmother gave me her copy when I was 16, and I've been reading him ever since." She paused, studying him with that same quiet attention. "You look like someone who reads him too." The observation landed in a place he didn't expect, because people rarely looked at him and saw anything beyond what was right there. A quiet man with gray hair and reading glasses, someone you'd pass on the street without a second thought. But this woman looked at him the way Margaret used to, like there was more to the story than what showed on the surface. "I do," he said, and it came out softer than he meant it to. "My wife, she used to read him to me." The word wife hung in the air for a moment, and Henry wished he could take it back, because it was too much, too personal, too fast. But the woman didn't flinch, or change the subject, or offer the kind of uncomfortable sympathy that made him want to walk away. She just nodded slowly, the way you do when someone tells you something true, and you understand why they told it. "I'm Evelyn," she said. "Henry. Nice to meet you, Henry." She tucked the Rilke under her arm and glanced toward the front of the shop, where Harold was turning the sign on the door from open to closed. "Looks like they're shutting down for the night." Harold called out that they had 5 minutes, and Henry realized with a small pang that the evening was over, which was strange because it had barely begun. He started toward the door, and Evelyn fell into step beside him, her boots clicking softly on the old wood floor. At the door she paused and turned to him. The light from the street lamp caught her face and made her look like she belonged in one of those novels where everything hinges on a single moment. "I just moved to town," she said. "Apartment above the flower shop on 2nd Street. I'll probably be back here a lot." "I'm here most Tuesdays and Thursdays," Henry said. And then, because he wasn't sure if that sounded like an invitation or just a fact, he added, "Harold makes good tea." Evelyn smiled again, wider this time, and pulled her coat tighter against the rain. "Then I'll see you Tuesday, Henry." She stepped out into the wet evening, and Henry watched her go, standing in the doorway of the bookshop with the warm lamp light behind him and the cold rain in front of him, and he felt something he hadn't felt in a very long time. He felt like he wanted to be somewhere again. Henry told himself it was just his regular routine, that he would have gone to the bookshop on Tuesday regardless of what had happened Thursday, and that was true. But it wasn't the whole truth. The whole truth was that he got there 20 minutes earlier than usual, and he'd changed his shirt before leaving the house. He'd even stood in front of the mirror wondering if he should have shaved, which was absurd because he'd shaved that morning like he always did, but he'd still wondered. Evelyn stood by the fiction section with a book open in her hands and a cup of tea on the windowsill beside her, and when the bell rang and she looked up, her face did something that made his chest feel tight. It lit up. Not in a dramatic way, not in the way people perform surprise or delight, but in the way a room changes when someone you're glad to see walks through the door. "I saved you a seat," she said, nodding toward the leather chair, where a second cup of tea sat waiting on the small table. Harold, it seemed, had already figured out what was happening, because Harold noticed everything and said nothing, which was the best quality a bookshop owner could have. Henry sat down, and Evelyn settled into the chair across from him, and for a moment they just looked at each other across the tea and the lamplight. Two people who had been strangers 4 days ago and now felt like something else entirely. She asked him what he was reading, and he told her about the Barrie poems, and she told him she'd never read Barrie, but she loved the way Wendell sounded like someone you could trust. He laughed at that. A short, surprised laugh that came from somewhere he'd forgotten existed, and she grinned like she'd been hoping for exactly that reaction. They talked about books the way some people talk about the weather, easily and at length, finding connection in the small differences of taste and the large shared affections. She loved stories about ordinary people whose lives turned on a single moment. A chance meeting, a letter that arrived late, a door left open when it should have been closed. He said he'd always been drawn to the same kind of story, the quiet ones where everything changes without anyone raising their voice. At some point, she asked him what he did, and he told her he'd retired from the post office 2 years ago, that he'd sorted mail for 31 years and never once found it boring because every envelope was a small story heading somewhere. She said that was the most unexpected answer she'd ever heard to that question, and she meant it. He could tell because she didn't laugh or move on. She asked what he liked about it, and he found himself telling her about the holiday cards with their messy family photos. He told her about the letters from overseas that arrived with foreign stamps, and the faint smell of somewhere far away, and the way a handwritten envelope felt different from everything else in the bin. She listened the way people listen when they're genuinely curious, not waiting for their turn to talk, but actually hearing what you're saying. And somewhere in the middle of all that easy talk, Henry realized he was about to say something he'd never said to anyone since Margaret, and he caught himself just in time, because the words were right there, close enough to touch, and they frightened him. He let the moment pass, but he could feel it still there, waiting the way a held breath waits to be released. And then she started telling him about herself. She told him about leaving her last town because she'd spent too long trying to be what other people expected, and not enough time figuring out what she actually wanted. She'd come here because it was small and quiet, and nobody knew her, and she thought maybe she could start over in a place like that. He asked her what she wanted now, and she looked at him for a long moment, her eyes steady and warm, and said, "I want to be someplace where people see me for who I am, not for what they think I should be." The words landed in a place Henry recognized. He'd been living in that same place for 3 years, invisible in plain sight, a man people looked past on the street and nodded to in the post office without ever really seeing. And somehow this young woman, this stranger he'd met 4 days ago in a bookshop, had looked at him and seen exactly what was there. Harold announced closing, and they stood up, and as they walked toward the door, Evelyn said, "Same time. Thursday?" Henry nodded, not trusting his voice to come out steady. She smiled and stepped into the evening, and he watched her go and realized that for the first time since Margaret, he was already looking forward to the next time. Thursday came the way. Thursdays always did, slow and gray. But this one felt different, because there was something at the end of it that mattered. Henry spent the morning doing the things he always did, reading the paper, making toast, walking to the hardware store for a box of nails he didn't really need. And in the back of his mind the whole time was a low hum of anticipation that he couldn't ignore and couldn't explain. He stood in front of the closet longer than usual. His usual sweater, the blue one with the fray at the collar, hung where it always did, and he reached for it and then stopped. Instead, he pulled out a pressed white shirt he hadn't worn in over a year, the kind of shirt you wear when you want someone to notice that you made an effort. And he buttoned it carefully and looked at himself in the mirror and thought, "You fool," and then thought, maybe not. When he walked into the bookshop, Evelyn was at the corner table with 2 cups of tea, already steaming on the small table. She looked up, and her eyes moved over the shirt and back to his face, and she smiled in a way that told him she'd noticed, and that she was glad, and that she wasn't going to make a big deal of it. "You look nice," she said simply, and those 3 words carried more warmth than a compliment from anyone else would have this evening. The conversation went deeper. She told him about the town. She'd left a place not far from here, but far enough where she'd worked at a small publishing company and spent her lunch breaks in the used bookstore across the street. She said she'd had friends there, good ones. But she'd spent so long being the version of herself they expected that she'd lost track of where their image of her ended and the real her began. Henry understood that. Quote, he'd spent 31 years at the post office, being reliable Henry, quiet Henry, the man who never missed a day, and never caused trouble, and never asked for more than what was in front of him. It was a good life, a steady life. But somewhere along the way, he'd stopped being the person who wanted things and become the person who just didn't ask. Then Evelyn said something that hit him like a bell struck in an empty room. "Most people look right through me," he said, stirring her tea without looking at it, looking at him instead. "They see what they want to see. You actually looked at me like I was a real person." Henry sat there with that sentence in his chest, turning it over, because he'd been thinking the same thing about her from the moment she'd asked him for help reaching that shelf. She was the one who had looked at him and seen something worth seeing, something beyond the gray hair and the quiet life and the routine, that had become a kind of hiding. "I was thinking the same thing about you," he said, and his voice came out rougher than he meant it to, because the truth often does when you've been sitting on it for a while. They shared a moment of quiet. Then, the kind that happens when two people recognize something in each other that neither of them expected to find. The lamplight was golden. Harold moved quietly behind the counter, and it felt like the whole place had drawn a breath and held it. As they left that evening, walking side by side toward the door, Evelyn reached over and touched his arm lightly, just above the elbow, a brief warmth through the fabric of his shirt, and then she said goodnight. The touch lasted less than 2 seconds, but it stayed with him all the way home, a small bright spot on his skin that the quiet house couldn't wash away. He sat in his chair that night, the one Margaret used to sit in, and he realized something he hadn't expected. For the first time in 3 years, the silence in the house didn't feel as heavy. It wasn't gone, and it probably never would be entirely, but something had shifted, the way a window cracked open in a stale room lets in just enough air to remind you what fresh feels like. That small change, that barely noticeable lightness, was about to lead him somewhere he never thought he'd go. A week passed, and Henry went to the bookshop on Tuesday, the way he always did. But this time when he walked through the door and the bell rang and he looked toward the corner table, Evelyn wasn't there. The leather chair sat empty, and the small table held only 1 cup of tea. And Harold was behind the counter with the kind of expression that said he'd noticed too. Henry sat down and picked up a book and tried to read, but the words swam past without sticking. Every time the bell rang he looked up, and every time it was someone else, a man with a dog-eared paperback, a teenager looking for a school assignment. Each time, the disappointment hit a little harder because he hadn't realized how much he'd been counting on her being there until she wasn't. He stayed until closing, longer than he usually would, pretending to browse the aisles he'd walked 100 times, and the whole time a voice in the back of his head grew louder and more certain. Of course she wouldn't keep coming back. She was young and bright and had her whole life ahead of her, and what did he have to offer but a corner chair and a cup of tea, and an evening spent talking about books with a man old enough to be her father? He'd been foolish to think this was anything more than passing friendliness, the kind of warmth a stranger shows you once and then forgets about by morning. He walked home through the dark streets, feeling the weight of his isolation pressing in on all sides. It was worse than before, because now he knew what it felt like when that weight lifted, and the difference between the two made the return that much harder. The house was cold when he opened the door, and the chair was empty, and the silence filled every room like water filling a jar. And he sat down and thought, well, at least I had those evenings, and that will have to be enough. The next evening, there was a knock at his door. He wasn't expecting anyone, and he almost didn't answer, because the only people who knocked were delivery drivers and neighbors returning borrowed tools, and he didn't want either. But the knock came again. Light and deliberate, the kind of knock that belongs to someone who means it. He opened the door and found Evelyn standing on his porch, holding a book, and looking like she'd run part of the way there. "I'm so sorry," she said, and the words came out in a rush, and her cheeks were pink from the cold. "My car broke down on the road past the bridge, and my phone died, and I couldn't get to the shop, and I couldn't call you because I didn't have your number." She stopped and took a breath, and then she said the thing that cracked him open. "I didn't want you to think I just disappeared." The care in those words, the simple, unadorned care of someone who worried about what he'd think. Someone who wanted him to know she hadn't chosen to be absent. Someone who came to his house in the cold to make sure he understood. It undid every wall he'd built in the past 24 hours. He stood there in the doorway looking at her, this young woman on his porch in the dark, and he felt something give way in his chest, something he'd been holding together with nothing but stubbornness and habit. "Come in," he said. "I'll make tea." She stepped inside, and for the first time they weren't in the bookshop. They were in his space, his world, the small house with the quiet rooms, and Margaret's reading glasses still in the drawer, and the coffee maker that still sometimes brewed 2 cups out of habit. And somehow, against all reason, Evelyn fit into it like she'd always known the layout, like she'd walked through the rooms in a dream once and was now just remembering where everything was. They sat in the kitchen with their tea, and she told him about the car trouble, laughing a little at herself for the chaos of it. He told her about the evening he'd spent waiting and trying not to, and they were both honest in a way that people usually save for much later, if they ever get there at all. By the time she left, the house didn't feel as cold, and the chair didn't feel as empty, and the silence felt less like a weight and more like a room that was slowly being filled. After that evening, the bookshop became their place. Not just Tuesdays and Thursdays anymore, but whenever she could get there and whenever he could bring himself to leave the house on an off day, which was happening more often now. Harold gave them the corner table by the window, as if it had always been theirs. He started bringing 2 cups of tea without being asked, setting them down with a quiet nod and retreating behind the counter, a man who understood that some things didn't need commentary. They developed rituals the way couples do, though neither of them had used that word. Yet she read aloud to him from whatever she'd found that day, her voice unhurried and warm, giving each sentence room to land. He'd listen with his eyes on the page, or sometimes on her, because watching her read was like watching someone pray, fully present, completely absorbed. He recommended books from the shelves he knew by heart, pulling down novels he'd loved for decades. He'd watch her discover them for the first time, and her reactions were always genuine, sometimes delighted, sometimes shaken, always fully felt. One evening, she found a slim volume on the poetry shelf, a collection by a writer neither of them had heard of. She read a passage aloud about an older man and a younger woman who found each other across a garden wall in a small town in Italy. The words were simple, and the story was gentle, but the parallels were impossible to miss, and when she finished the passage, she paused and looked at him with an expression he couldn't quite read, something between tenderness and a question, as if she was offering him the story and waiting to see if he'd take it. He didn't take it, not then. He smiled and said the writing was beautiful, and she nodded and moved on. But the moment stayed in the air between them like a note that hadn't been resolved, and the question she'd asked without asking was still waiting for an answer. They started leaving small things for each other the way you do when you're thinking about someone when they're not there. He found a bookmark with a pressed flower tucked inside a collection of essays he'd been meaning to read. He knew it was from her because the flower was from the shop on 2nd Street where she'd told him the bouquets were always too expensive, but the single stems were just right. She found a note in his handwriting, slipped into the Rilke, just 3 words, "For your grandmother." She told him later that she'd cried when she read it, not from sadness, but from being understood so precisely by someone she hadn't known a month ago. He left a pressed leaf from the maple tree in his yard, inside a novel about the sea. She left a drawing on a napkin, small sketch of 2 chairs beside a table with 2 cups, and he kept it in his wallet where Margaret's photo used to be. And he didn't feel guilty about that, because guilt had finally given way to something else. The other customers in the shop began to notice them, and there were glances, the kind of glances people give when they see something they don't quite understand or don't quite approve of. A man his age and a woman hers, sharing tea and books and quiet laughter in a corner where the lamplight made everything look golden and private. But Henry didn't care anymore. Being seen with her felt like being seen at all, and if someone wanted to judge that, they could take it up with their own loneliness. One evening, she rested her head on his shoulder while they read, a slow, easy lean like she'd been doing it for years. He held perfectly still, because he was afraid that if he moved, if he acknowledged what was happening, the moment would realize it was too good to last and dissolve. She didn't pull away, but stayed beside him, her breathing slowing as the shop hummed around them. For those few minutes the world was exactly the right size. The comment came on a Saturday. Henry and Evelyn sat at their usual table while she read aloud from a novel about a lighthouse keeper, and the shop had a few other customers scattered through the aisles. A man in a canvas jacket walked past their corner, on his way to the counter, and as he passed he glanced at them and said something to Harold. Henry couldn't quite hear the words, but he caught the tone, and he caught Harold's quiet response and the way Harold's eyes narrowed. Evelyn didn't seem to notice, but Henry noticed, and the words the man had said, even muffled, lodged somewhere beneath his ribs, like a splinter that wouldn't work its way out. That night he lay in bed staring at the ceiling, and the splinter worked itself deeper. He turned it over the way you turn over a problem that doesn't have a solution, just a slow erosion of the thing you'd been building. She was half his age, nearly. She was beautiful in the way that stops people on the street. All that dark hair and that warm smile and those eyes that saw straight through to whatever was underneath. She could have anyone she wanted, and the world was full of men. Her own age with steady jobs and sharp jaws and whole lives ahead of them, unmarked by loss. He couldn't imagine what she saw in a gray-haired man who spent his evenings alone in a bookshop, whose greatest adventure in the past 3 years had been trying a new brand of tea. The doubt grew, the way doubt does, feeding on silence and the long hours of the night, and by morning it had taken on the shape of certainty. Not the certainty of fact, but the certainty of fear, and fear is always louder and always more convincing. He started pulling back that week, arriving a little later, leaving a little earlier, giving shorter answers to her questions, laughing less easily at her observations. He canceled Thursday with a thin excuse about errands, and her voice on the other end of the line went quiet, and he told himself it was for the best, because pulling away now would hurt less than being left later. But Evelyn noticed immediately, because she was the kind of person who noticed everything about the people she cared for, and she wasn't the kind to let a distance grow without asking why. She showed up at his house on Friday evening, and this time she wasn't apologetic or breathless from the cold. She stood in his doorway with her hands in her coat pockets, concerned and a little frustrated. She looked at him with those steady warm eyes and said, "What's going on with you?" He tried to deflect, said he'd been tired, said it was nothing, but she stood there and waited, and he'd never met anyone who could outwait silence the way she could. Finally he said, "Someone at the shop made a comment. About us. About the difference in our ages." Evelyn's expression didn't change, but something behind her eyes sharpened, and she stepped past him into the house without being invited, and she sat down in the kitchen chair like she belonged there, and she told him something that cut deeper than anything had in a long time. "I'm not here because I have nowhere else to be," she said, her voice low and clear and completely steady. "I'm here because I want to be here. With you, and I need you to stop deciding for me what I should want." The room went quiet, and Henry sat down across from her because his legs didn't feel entirely reliable, and he looked at this woman who had shown up at his door in the cold to tell him he was wrong about what she saw. It was the silence of someone turning something over in his heart, someone standing at the edge of a decision and feeling the weight of what it would mean to step forward instead of back. Henry didn't sleep that night. He lay in the dark and turned over Evelyn's words slowly, examining them from every side, understanding for the first time what they were really made of. She told him to stop deciding for her, and the truth of that cut deep. He'd been doing exactly that, crafting her reasons for her, deciding she was too young and too vibrant and too beautiful to genuinely choose a quiet man in his late 50s. Doing so, he'd taken away her agency and replaced it with his fear. He thought about Margaret then. Not with the usual ache of loss, but with something closer to gratitude. She taught him how to love someone fully and without reservation, how to pay attention to the small details that make a life together feel like home. She taught him how to listen with your whole heart and speak with your whole truth. And he knew, with a certainty that surprised him, that she would not want him to spend the rest of his days protecting himself from the very thing she'd given him. She would want him to love again. She would want him to be brave enough to stay in the room. The next evening, he went to the bookshop, and he brought something with him. Margaret's copy of the Rilke, the one she'd bought at this very shop years ago, the one with her margin notes in pencil and a pressed violet between the pages of the 7th poem, the one he'd kept on the nightstand for 3 years because it was the last place her handwriting lived. He carried it in his coat like something sacred, and when he sat down at the corner table and Evelyn arrived a few minutes later with her usual warm smile and her usual cup of tea, he set it on the table between them. She looked at the book, then at him, and he watched her understand what it meant, watched the recognition move across her face, like light moving across a wall. This was the most important thing he owned, and he was sharing it with her, and that said everything his voice couldn't. This was Margaret's. He said, "She used to read it to me, right here in this corner." Evelyn picked it up gently and opened it, and she found the pressed violet and the penciled notes, and she traced the handwriting with her fingertip, and her eyes were bright but not sad. She had beautiful handwriting, she said. She had a beautiful way of seeing things, Henry said, and then, because the words had been building inside him all night, and they needed a place to go, he said, "I'm done running from this. I'm done deciding what you should want. I want to be wherever you are, Evelyn, and I'm sorry it took me so long to say it." She didn't say anything grand. She didn't need to. She just reached across the table and took his hand, and they sat together in their corner of the bookshop, with the Rilke open between them and the lamp casting its warm circle of light, and the silence that filled the space around them was the kind that says everything without making a sound. The weeks that followed were quiet and full in a way Henry hadn't known weeks could be. Mornings at his kitchen table with 2 cups of coffee instead of 1. Her laugh moving through the rooms that had been still for so long. Her books stacked beside his on the shelf by the window. She kept her apartment above the flower shop, and he didn't push and she didn't rush, because they'd both learned that the things worth having are the things worth letting arrive in their own time. Harold added a second chair to the corner table, a matching leather one, and he set it in place one Tuesday without comment, and when Henry and Evelyn arrived and saw it, they looked at each other and smiled. Harold caught their eye from behind the counter and gave one of his rare nods, and that was that. Henry started writing again after years of only reading. Small pieces about the things they found together in the shelves, the way a story could hold 2 people in the same place, even when they came from different times, the way a bookshop was really just a room full of invitations waiting for someone brave enough to open one. Evelyn read every piece and told him honestly what worked and what didn't, and he trusted her judgment the way he'd once trusted his own routine, completely and without question. The bookshop became something more than a place to buy books. It became the place where 2 people who thought they'd be alone found each other instead. And if the other customers noticed, if there were still glances and whispers, Henry didn't care. He'd spent 3 years invisible, and he wasn't going back. One evening, late in November, they sat in their corner with the rain on the windows and the lamplight golden, and a book of poems opened between them. Evelyn read aloud the same Rilke passage that Margaret used to read, and the words landed differently now. Not with the ache of loss, but with the warmth of continuation, the sense that the story hadn't ended, it had simply turned a page. Henry looked at the woman beside him, her dark hair loose, her voice soft and steady, and he thought about how the silence he'd feared for so long wasn't emptiness at all. It was just a room waiting for the right voice to fill it. Sometimes the moment that changes everything arrives so quietly you almost miss it, and all you have to do is stay in the room long enough to let it find you. If this story warmed your heart, leave a comment below and let us know which moment got you the most.